Hello, it's Mr. Wood here. Welcome to our fifth lesson on Theme D on religion, peace and conflict. Today's lesson is about just war. Our objectives today are to know the two main aspects of the just war theory and to understand the criteria of a just war. You're then going to move on in your own time and do a bit of research and apply the just war theory to a real war and evaluate whether or not that war could be justified. You'll need to know today, you need to know that for some Christians, sometimes war is a necessary evil that could and should be used to prevent a greater evil from occurring. The just war theory gives a criteria for Christians to determine when it's okay and justified to go to war and how that war should be fought. Let's jump into it right now. Okay, just to get you thinking before we start the actual topic today, I want you to just pause for a moment and imagine that your head teacher at your school has decided that sometimes fights are the best way to solve disputes between students, rather than them arguing about it and falling out on social media or it carrying on. The head teacher says, do you know what, let's just get them together, they can have a physical fight and then we'll draw a line under it. Now, I'd like you to have a think and come with 3 rules about when you think it would be acceptable for 2 students to fight, or more than 2, that might be a rule you come up with, and 3 rules about what can happen in that fight. Maybe just pause the video here and have a go at that, and then when you're ready, unpause. Okay, hopefully you had a good think about that. Hold on to that thought for now, because we are going to come back to that shortly. So even though many Christians are pacifists, which is a key word we've looked at a few times, and we're going to do more detail in a few lessons time, it basically means someone who's anti-violence, who doesn't agree with violence. So even though most Christians don't agree with violence, many fought in World War II. Now, why do you think that was? Well, potentially it had something to do with this man in this movement, Hitler and the Nazis. Many Christians felt that it would be wrong to let Hitler and the Nazi Party continue doing what they were doing and not step up to stop them. For these Christians, war was a necessary evil. We looked last lesson at this spectrum about how many Christians and many religious people view violence. And Christians who fight in a war would probably say that war is sometimes a necessary evil. It is something that you should do as a religious person to stop a greater evil from occurring. Now, this is a guy called Thomas Aquinas. Now, basically, way before Thomas Aquinas, there was a guy called Augustine. And Augustine said that sometimes a war, there could be such a thing as a just war, a fair war, a war that Christians should fight in. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century took this thought on even further. And he recognized that killing people was wrong, but that it seemed that sometimes it was the only way to fix a problem would be to go to war. Now, we started moments ago looking at this question about your head teacher and the fight in school. If we just change a couple of words now, this is effectively the just war theory. Thomas Aquinas says that he changed effectively the rules for fighting in a war and decided that sometimes wars are the best way to resolve disputes between certain countries. And he thought about when it would be okay to have a war and then what can happen in that war. This is the just war theory, when it's justified to fight and then how that fight should be done. So pause here and have a go at these questions to check your understanding. And when you've finished, unpause it and we'll look at some answers. So, 2 aspects of war. Which 2 does just war theory cover? It covers when it's acceptable to go to war and how wars should be fought. When do you think it'd be acceptable for England to go to war? And if never, explain why. You might have said it's acceptable for England to go to war if they're under attack, if they were trying to protect a weaker nation. You might say it would be acceptable for them to gain more land. And you might have thought about those reasons of war we looked at in the last lesson, for example, retaliation. The extension there was Jesus said, love your neighbour. Sometimes the most loving thing is to go to war to protect them. And did you agree? And you might have said there that yes, you do agree, because protecting those you love by fighting people who want to hurt them would be a good thing to do. But you might have disagreed and said actually you could never really say I'm being loving while you're killing someone. That is the 2 things that they just can't work together. So Thomas Aquinas basically said there should be a checklist of reasons that make a war just or not. And if a war ticks everything on that criteria, on that checklist, then it can be justified. And this checklist, this criteria, becomes known as the just war theory. And there are 6 elements to this checklist that Christians use to determine whether or not a war can be deemed a just war. For each one we look at now, I'd like to write it down, and then we're going to move on and come back to reflect on them afterwards. So number 1, the war must have a just cause, a fair cause. Basically, this means that there's a fair and good reason to go to war. Now, we looked at reasons for war last lesson, and self-defense or defending someone else would be a good and a just reason to go to war, whereas greed or retaliation would not be. The second criteria is that the war should be declared by the correct authority. That means that not any old person can just say, hey, we're going to go to war. I couldn't say, England, we're going to war. It would have to come from the government or the lawful ruler of that country. The intention of the war has to be to defeat wrongdoing and promote good. Now, the good that's achieved by going to war has to outweigh the evil that occurs during warfare. And so there has to be thought about the intention. Why are we doing this? Are we doing this for the right reason? Fighting must be a last resort. You've tried everything else. You've tried talking to them. You've tried all the different ways of doing diplomacy. You've had advocates speak on your behalf, and nothing has worked. You've tried it all. You're saying, okay, this is the last resort now. We are going to war, but we have tried everything else already. Number 5, there must be a reasonable chance of success. It would be really out of order to take your country to a war that you thought you were probably going to lose. The amount of people who are going to die from your own country and the amount of people who are going to be killed from the other country, it just would not be fair if you were doing that, knowing that you weren't actually going to succeed eventually. So there needs to be a reasonable chance of success. And number 6, that the methods that you use to fight the war must be proportional to achieve success. So there's no need for excessive force. You're going to fight the war with proportional means. Okay, hopefully you wrote this down as we went. If you need to rewind, please do. But I'd like to now just go through and draw a symbol for each of the just war theory. Which one do you think is the most important point? Which is the most important criteria? Explain your answer. Which is the least important? Explain your answer. And would you add anything to that criteria? Now, I'm not going to be feeding back on these. This is your own opinion and your own reflection. So once you've done that, push play and we'll get through the rest of the video. Okay, so we know that just war theory, it covers when it's okay to have a war, but it also covers what can happen once the war has started. And so during a just war, it doesn't mean that anything goes. For it to be just, civilians should not be the targets of military operations. It's likely the civilians are going to get killed in a war, but they should not be the target ever. And torture is never allowed. And prisoners and non-combatants, people who aren't fighting, should all be treated humanely. What I'd like to do as we come to a close now in this is just to Google and research some wars in history. Use the criteria you've learned and decide for yourself, was that a just war or not? And that brings us to the end of the lesson. So since we're here, let's just go back to our need to know for this lesson and make sure that you know this. That for some Christians, war is a necessary evil that could be used to prevent a greater evil from occurring. The just war theory gives a criteria for Christians to determine when it's okay to war, and then once they're at war, how that war should be fought. Thanks for being here today. Looking forward to seeing you in our next lesson.